Welcome again to another edition of the Southwest Climate Podcast. Mike Crimmins.
Hey, Zach.
How you doing?
It's good. It's still 2020 as far as I can tell. It's been 133 months long, but I think it is still 2020, right?
I felt like I had to have like an animated intro because what a long week.
It was a long week.
It's Friday.
It's not over yet, technically.
It's technically not over. It is close to quitting time on Friday. And, I actually look forward to these podcasts every month on Friday. They're good times. They're good therapy and a good way to end the week.
I agree. And they always end with me cracking open a beer, not during work time. Maybe really, really clear about that. That's
well, I think it would be legitimate if, we had a few while we were doing this. I think that's allowed. Particularly because
I'm not sure it is.
Hey, my office is now my living room. Sometimes it's my bedroom. Occasionally it's my other spare room.
I gotcha. I have a dorm room. I've converted my back bedroom into a dorm room. So
I do feel like we have to raise our game because the animation in this prep we're struggling right now. It's been a tiring week, but hopefully we can pull it together, Mike. And we got a lot of cool, interesting things to talk about. One of them being we are in certainly unprecedented times right now. And I'm talking about climate, not about politics. We are in unprecedented times coming into the winter season on the heels of the driest monsoon season and into a La Niña, which we'll talk a lot about. So we'll just sort of unpack like how unprecedented it is and what does it all mean. So that's one thing you got to look forward to. We just came through another dry month yet again. The dry summer has persisted into our fall. So we'll review October weather. And then we said last time that we would take a little bit of a deeper dive into the fire situation. Normally it's not a time, at least in Arizona and New Mexico, that we talk about fire because fire is something that at this point in the year is in the rearview mirror. It's not for California, but this year it's been different in part because of the very dry and warm summer. So darn it, Mike, we are still talking about the monsoon.
I know. I wish you'd stop. I wish you would just make it go away.
Okay. How long will we feel the monsoon in our conversations? Maybe that's for later, but I'm just curious, because I'm not sure we can get out of it for at least a few more months. And it was wishful thinking.
Oh, that's what you're talking about. I thought I'd say if we're still doing this 10 years from now, which I hope we are, I will still be talking about the 2020 monsoon.
Oh, I meant more like in impacts related.
Oh.
How much is the record dry monsoon going to be with us that we'll be talking about it in a climate impacts kind of way?
I don't know. And I think that you preface this kind of whole podcast content here with the idea that we're in kind of uncharted territory in the historical record anyways. I was looking at some different data sets. You can carve the data a lot of different ways, but if you look at the last 3 months, 4 months, 6 months, it's the driest on record for many locations across the Southwest. So that puts us in the historical record kind of at the bottom, right? But then to have a La Niña event staring us in the face, which suggests that we will be below average for many more months. That combination of months, I don't know. I don't exactly know what that looks like, but maybe we can kind of kick that around a little bit more.
Yeah, I think that's a good foreshadow of where we'll go to in this podcast. But let's start with October. October, you've said this often. October climatologically is our transition month in terms of the westerlies. We get these loops in the jet stream that can ferry in cold and if they're in the right configuration, they can pull moisture up from the tropics and really produce some wet months. Also, conversely, you have quite a bit of years where it's it's just dry. You don't get those storms, or if you do have a passage of a low pressure system, it can be moisture starved. That's not out of the ordinary. And this year, in fact, we've had zero precipitation in October in Tucson and in Phoenix, and just a wee bit. I'm not even sure I believe the wee bit. You've been up there, Mike, or at least you've been conversing with people up in the Four Corners area, Flagstaff area. But it does look like from the data that I'm looking at that they had just a little bit more than a tenth of an inch in parts up there. But for the most part, another dry month. And I would just also say that zero precipitation in Tucson and Phoenix is not out of the ordinary. So I looked at the past record for Tucson, and in the 73 years that I was looking at, 12 of them had less than 0.05 inches. That was the cutoff that I used. Basically, very little rain, if anything, if you can call it rain. So 12 of the 73 years had zero. And for Tucson, 19 of the 82 years was not zero, sorry, but less than 0.05 inches. So not dry, unfortunate given where we just came from, but clearly something that happens often.
Yeah, absolutely. So October is, just like you said, is a transition month. And if we look historically across the Southwest, in the historical record, we have everything from some of the record wettest local precipitation records broken with tropical storms that have moved up Gulf of California and wandered up through the Southwest, just outside of the monsoon season occurring in October. And we've got, as you noted, a handful of months with actually zero precipitation at all. So if you look across the Southwest, we got these really wide bands from min to max. And so if you use the average, it tends to, those really wet years, drag up the average. So just using the average or percent of average will often give you kind of a misleading, is that you'll often more frequently be below average. But in this past month, it was a lot like September, kind of weather-wise. We had that continuation of those ridging events that were giving us those really hot conditions. We started the month with, strings of 100-degree days continuing in Tucson when we're down here. And that, it kind of ebbed and flowed, this broad, big ridge across the western U.S. It built up in the early part of the month, but we did start to see it kind of transition into something that's more westerly. So it kind of flattened out. Storms were kind of zipping across the Pacific Northwest, Intermountain West. And then we had one precip event across the Southwest that occurred towards the end of the month, around the 25th or 26th. And that's where Flagstaff ended up squeaking out 0.05 of an inch. If you move over into New Mexico did better. And so some locations like Gallup got a little over a 0.5 inch, and Albuquerque ends up with the month at a little shy of a 1/4 inch. And then even a little further east of the state, it's almost up around 0.7. And that's for the total for October. So, and again, I think most of it fell in that late month event that was a low pressure system that dropped straight out of the Pacific Northwest, dragged down a bunch of cold air, and it brought a little moisture with it, intercepted a little moisture to the south, and produced some localized convection across the high country of Arizona. The east side of Tucson got a little bit of precip where the west side didn't. And then New Mexico ended up getting a little bit.
You got a little rain?
Nothing. I think it would have been a trace. Yeah. I don't think it tipped. I don't think it tipped the tipping bucket.
I mean, it was nothing. I was upset, but I had people, it was pretty funny. I had people chiming in and being like, did you get your rain? Like, we got a little bit. And I'm like, wow, the baselines have been really reset this year.
I was the same way. I think I remember that day because it was first of all, the temperatures crashed. So Tucson ended up setting a record low for the day and had a freezing event, which was interesting. If you remember last October, right around Halloween, we had a very similar event that dropped straight south, but no precip with it. But really cold air. I mean, it was such a contrast from what we had been feeling here for the last 6 months, that those like 2 days were enough to like lift my spirits in amazing ways. I mean, because I didn't even get any rain. I think it was mostly wind, cold temperatures. I saw some virga over there, and so that, you're right. That's how low the bar is now.
Yeah, brought some snows to the high country.
Right.
And the temperatures really did plummet, and we did go from summer to winter, as often is the case.
Right, and then we went right back to summer.
Yeah,
so,
it was short-lived.
A little bit disappointing because we got that little taste of comfortable weather and we went right back to near record, if not record temperatures across locations of the Southwest in the last week, especially.
So that was the only wiggle really in the jet stream that brought any semblance of a low pressure system through our area. Do you recall?
Yeah, I mean, the rest of the month was basically characterized by ridging conditions. There was a little wiggle in the middle part of the month, but it brought wind. It wasn't very strong. This was the most pronounced, low pressure system that dropped out of the higher latitudes that actually had some cold air with it that we've seen yet this season. But like right now, as we're recording this podcast, we're just on the cusp of another very similar event that could bring a little bit more precip to the region and another cool down in temperatures.
So this is forecasted over the weekend, right? So we're coming at you. We're recording this on Friday. I don't even know what day it is. November 6th.
Yeah.
So this event is forecasted for this weekend, correct?
That's right. Yeah. And it's actually, I don't know if you have access to a window right now, but we've had some really nice high clouds kind of streaming in all day. Temps are a little bit lower. It's only in the 80s rather than the mid 90s today. And, I've been kind of paying attention, and we'll talk a little bit more about this the rest of the podcast, but the longer term outlook with this La Niña event really felt like we're going to get locked into something very warm, very dry, because we'd had this kind of persistent pattern in September and October. But this is a decent event. It's not super wet, but it looks like it's cold enough. It might put down a little bit of snow and a little bit of precip. And then subsequent, if you look at the longer term forecast, 6 to 10 and 8 to 14, it's not dry. So it's not necessarily wet, but it's cool. And we've got sort of equal chances looking at the next 2 weeks. So I don't know, maybe November won't be like the 2017 November, which was our last really knockdown drag out La Niña event where we had that record hot and dry winter.
That would be nice. What's the difference between this event that could potentially drop down more rain and the one that just sort of skirted that dropped precipitation more to the northern reaches of our Arizona, New Mexico? Is it that the jet stream isn't digging as far south, or is it that somehow it's not entraining as much moisture? The position of it, in other words, isn't conducive for bringing up subtropical moisture. Is there anything that we can say in comparison from this upcoming event to the last one?
Yeah. So this one, just looking at some of the weather forecasts right now, it's actually two low pressure systems that will swing through. So it's a broader long wave trough, we call, but it has two smaller short waves that'll rotate through it. And the first one, part of this longer wave trough is a little further off the West Coast. And rather than it being an inland storm, it's so that's a little bit better with that actually having some moisture. And as it kind of drops into the Southwest, and it rotates these two short waves through it, it's actually able to pull some subtropical moisture up with it. So it looks like it'll have a little bit better access to moisture than the previous October event.
So why though is the jet stream looping more to our west important? I didn't quite get that. Like, how does that factor into rainfall?
These storm systems we have in the wintertime, they can either bring moisture with them or not, and it's usually an and they can intercept some lower latitude moisture. And typically it's a combination. And so if they're cold and they bring moisture with them, if they have more sort of an oceanic trajectory, then they preserve a little bit more of that moisture and can kind of carry more with them. If it's more of an inland trajectory, then they're kind of working out some of that moisture, and they can end up they can get dried out as they sort of slide on the inside of the Southwest. So it's kind of inside slider type events, is that they just didn't have much moisture with them. And if they don't access any when they're down at this latitude, they're just dry and cold, which are super, super common here in Arizona.
Yeah, that reminds me, I think it was last Thanksgiving, I was traveling through Utah and we got a bunch of rain. I think it was last Thanksgiving. And it just always strikes me as like, wow, like it's amazing that there's any precipitation for how far the storm has to traverse over the land and how many mountain ranges and sort of topography it traverses. It's just strange to me that there's still moisture around. So
I know I'm so with you on that too, because it is there. And there are little studies where these river valleys, the big river valleys of in the Pacific Northwest and through the Intermountain West, end up being really important channels of sort of low level moisture. And if you think about it too, these colder systems, they don't end up having a lot of moisture. So if they're cold, they just become really efficient sort of snowmakers. And if they drop down here and they're at subtropical moisture is warmer, and it's going to have more, it just has more moisture to work with at that point. So those can end up being much more efficient rain events or snow events as we get down here.
So the other thing, the temperature thing for October was, we did have that event that, like you said, brought record cold temperatures for that brief period. But by and large, it was another month of warm conditions. At least looking at the temperature anomaly from the West-wide drought tracker, Mike. I mean, Arizona and Western New Mexico is pretty much painted in all above average temperatures. Eastern New Mexico, on the other hand, was near average or slightly below average temperatures. But again, that's a pattern that is not all that unexpected. There's some trend in there, but also, if we get very few of these storms that come through, if we don't have the wiggles in the jet stream to bring these more northward originating storms, we're just not going to have the cold weather. So
yep, totally agree with you. And that just that the ridge of high pressure has just been relentless over the Southwest in particular, and just having that center of that ridge, which we had in September, which was not helpful for any monsoon activity, it kind of continued and it just baked us at that point. And so looking at that climate perspectives tool that the regional climate centers have together, I'm clicking on Tucson. And so Tucson was its third warmest average temperature for the last 30 days. And so you can imagine if we didn't have that record low temperature, that cold day in there, that it probably would have topped out as record warmest.
2020 keeps delivering, Mike.
It does. Extreme, baby.
All right. So anything more to highlight about October weather and climate that we didn't touch upon? I guess we didn't touch upon the lack of any sort of remnant tropical storm coming in, but that's obvious given that we didn't have any rain. Anything else to highlight?
No, I mean, I think that way you framed it is that it is a transition month and it can be extreme, and it really wasn't. I mean, I think the only extreme part about it would have been that it would have probably been record-breaking temps across the Southwest, a continuation of that, if we didn't have that one weather event come through in the later part of the month.
Yeah, you don't look for October to bust drought, or you don't bank on it, in other words. You
don't bank on it, but man, it can.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's. I think we've already put in the rearview mirror. Do you remember, just even a couple of years ago, we had a run of Octobers, and it wasn't that long ago. I can't remember the year off the top of my head, but Phoenix getting 7 inches of rain in October was only 3 Octobers ago, I think. It's so hard to even remember now at this point.
Yeah, it's funny. I looked back in the record and I looked at all of the years that had a very dry summer season. And I think there was 10 of them. I'm doing this a little bit off the top of my head because I've got so many spreadsheets open that I can't find the actual numbers, but I'm fairly confident what I'm about to say. So there was these 10 years that had SPI values for the summer monsoon at -1. So basically within the drier 33% percentiles. And then I looked at, what did October look like for those? And I think only 1 or 2 years actually had 1 or 2 Octobers of those 10 actually had wet conditions. So there did seem to be, I mean, this is just all nothing you can really draw conclusively. There's no dynamics part of this. It's just a small sample size statistics, but there did seem to be some persistence there. If you tended to have a dry summer, then that sort of persisted into the fall. But I think you would be like, yeah, but the dynamics that produce a dry October are completely different than the dynamics that produce a dry summer. And so there's a little bit of comparing apples to oranges.
No, I was actually going to argue the other way.
Really?
Yeah. Well, I was like, that, I don't know. I could kind of get behind that. I mean, especially if it's those summer totals were from active East Pacific storm systems or storm seasons, that especially if you had good contributions in August and September from those tropical storms and it was an active season, there's no reason to think that it would necessarily shut down right on September 30th, that it could linger into October. So maybe there is a little bit of kind of persistence in that too. And I also have been thinking a lot this year too, is that if you've had a really good wet monsoon season, you do have a little bit more moisture to recirculate and recycle that could even linger into the beginning of October. If you were to spark off something quasi-monsoonal, or, you just have probably some more moisture to actually potentially access in October, and maybe vice versa here. This is just such a stark example this year that there's just nothing to actually recycle, that, maybe that was, part of the reason here. But we didn't even have any weather features to actually capitalize on any moisture if we were to be able to access it.
I'm surprised that I had that so wrong with you. I would have thought you would have been agreeing with me. So,
well, I had my case of the Mondays on Monday, right? We already worked that out. So I'm a little more upbeat today, not as combative.
Yeah, we won't revisit that. Note to self, though, for anybody that interacts with Mike on a Monday, don't send him a paper and try to ask him his opinion the first thing in the morning, because
oh man, I should make a mental note to not review papers on a Monday too, because it would be totally unfair.
Okay, so moving along, we've talked ad nauseum about the dry summer season, and one of the main impacts of that has been what's become a pretty unusual fire season for a couple of respects, particularly, here in Arizona for the most part. I didn't spend a lot of time looking at New Mexico, so a lot of what I'm going to say is about Arizona. So particularly for Arizona, but, also in terms of the news, California has dominated the news in terms of fire. It's seen a record-breaking fire season in terms of acres burned, over 4 million or so, probably 4.5 million acres, which shattered its record. That is undoubtedly related to, in part, dry and warm conditions that we've seen in the Southwest. So what I think is interesting, Mike, is you made the point last time that the implications of historically dry monsoon season is that we're likely to see fire persist into October, for a longer period of time in the Southwest. And has that played out?
That's a good question. Did you figure it out?
I think I figured it out. Before we get into the numbers, though, I'm wondering if you think that narrative, if you've seen fire be more of a long-standing, persistent issue this year in comparison to other years.
It's funny. I don't know if it's funny at all, actually. I think I'm wrong.
Fire's not funny.
And I'm glad you're going to talk about the stats, which I think is really helpful. But I've started to look at it's the National Fire Danger Rating System metrics that they have. And then I just looked at the seasonal outlook by the National Interagency Fire Center for the Southwest. And there has been a decline in some of those fire danger rating indices that are weather-based for the Southwest. And then the outlook really is trending back to normal conditions. And I think this is largely the expectation that the fire weather, which will include much, much cooler conditions and cold overnight conditions, will really start to temper the rates of spread and the ability for fires to really, if they're ignited, take off. And we've also limited, lightning and that kind of stuff. So the outlook from NIFC, National Interagency Fire Center, is for normal fire activity in the short term, like through the next couple of months through the winter season. And I think a lot of it is probably what you're going to talk about, Zach, is climatologically, we do sort of trail off. So there is this whole idea, though, that we've come off the driest monsoon on record. Does that then change the situation at all? And I'm actually not sure that it does.
Okay, I'm just crunching the numbers here. A couple updates. One is I just looked up the statistics for California has a little bit over 4.3 million acres burned there. So I just wanted to be clear on that. All right, so a little bit of the climatology of fire. So I was just curious to ask the question, like, given the low rainfall, how many fires started in Arizona after the monsoon, the usual start of the monsoon in July? So how many fires began in July and persisted through to date? The Southwest Climate Coordination Center, and I'm only looking at fires larger than 100 acres. So these were considered their large fires. But on average being 1990 to 2008. So this graphic hasn't been updated for 12 years. But in that period, July on average saw in Arizona 13 fires larger than 100 acres. In August, 7.7. In September, 1.5. In October, 1. And then you dwindle to a fraction in November and in December. Let me do New Mexico just for comparison. New Mexico is a little bit lower across the board. Same pattern though. July 7 in New Mexico, August 3.5, September 1.5, October 1, November and December less than 1. All right, so I got my hands on data from 2000. I only had time to do 2010 through 2018. 2019 did not have data, and I had to eyeball 2020, but I got a good estimate. So, okay, so I just gave you the averages per month. So, on average, between July, September, October, November, and December in Arizona, about 23 fires happen in that period.
So
take a guess.
It's a low part of the season, right? The point is that it's typically not an active time, right?
That is right. Thank you for clarifying. That's right. This is like normally when the monsoon starts, the fire season ramps down. The question this year is, okay, we never really had a monsoon. So what was this season in comparison to an average season? And so on average, about 23 fires of greater than 100 acres occur in Arizona in those 6 months.
Right.
This year we've had 76.
That's more, right?
By my math, that's a lot more. And that's kind of what you would expect, or that's what I would have expected, but that's a lot more. And so then I did it by acres over those years. Somewhere in the vicinity of 50,000 acres have burned from those 23 fires this year. And again, I'm like eyeballing the PDF, trying to add a bunch of acres together for all of the 76. About 400,000 acres have burned.
Yow.
So it has been, Mike, a fairly long, drawn out, and in terms of acres burned, a fairly intense fire season, and one that is, at least by the numbers that I'm looking at, pretty uncharacteristic.
Yes, and so you'd kind of carved it up too, because I'm looking at one of the current fire maps. And again, by my sort of eyeballing data collection here too, I see 2 active fires in Arizona right now, and they seem to be close to being contained. So we're in November. So when you looked at those statistics, how many typically were occurring in like the months of November and December, right?
Well, few, a lot of them, a lot more than I expected occurred in August.
Yeah. Okay. So looking just at that distribution, most of that is occurring earlier in a dry monsoon. You'd expect to see most of those fires kind of burning in the summer season rather than in the fall. I guess
that's right. That's the point. You're right. It's that the fire season, the monsoon, the lack of the monsoon just increased the length of the fire season in ways that, quite frankly, are intuitive. But at least now we have data to put to that. The risk now falls for all the reasons that you said.
Right. And I think I was intimating that we've crossed some threshold of hyper mega dry monsoon and that we're going to have a new fire dynamic this fall. And I'm not sure, that's true. Right. I mean, like historically in climate, I'm sorry, what?
So what would you have thought that fire dynamic to be then?
I don't know. I don't think I was thinking. I think I was kind of off the cuff idea that dry is bad, but not thinking through there are these other parts to having a fire season. And so when it gets cold, that's not necessarily great for large wildfires. So again, it's not to say that there will be zero fires across the Southwest the next couple of months. The seasonal outlook talks about nuisance fires. And so these would be small fires that are kind of wind driven, maybe lower elevation, maybe even a couple of upper elevation. But I think that the expectation is just the fire climate and the fire weather taking over here is those cooler conditions, precipitation falling across upper elevations it won't be necessarily supportive of having large fire spread. Doesn't mean zero fires, but large fires taking off to over 100 acres and thousands of acres seems quite unlikely the next couple of months.
So it also raised, as I was doing this, it also raised sort of a different question, but how much does the dry summer matter for next fire season? Is it really, it's the winter stupid, in other words, it doesn't really matter? Or will we see, and this kind of gets at the question that I asked initially, which is how long will we be seeing the monsoon? How long will we be talking about the monsoon in terms of impacts? Does the last monsoon, the failed monsoon, deliver greater risk for fire conditions next year?
Were you going to answer it?
I will after you.
I have to go first. I think this is so interesting. And I'm just kind of offering up some ideas and some opinions. Okay. So I think in the conventional wisdom, and you'll talk a little bit about that paper that you suggested that we take a look at, the winter typically is related to spring fire activity through the winter precipitation, right? And so when we think about fires across the Southwest, we can have a mix of different types of fires, like low elevation fires that are carried on annuals or grasses that are grown from previous seasons. And then the kind of more destructive fire, those can be destructive fires, and they can be really big fires. Like I think, even this past year, looking at a couple of the lower elevation fires, including the sawmill fire here in the Catalinas actually started as a low elevation fire and was carried by a lot of the fine fuels that grew off of previous fall precipitation. So we end up having in the lower deserts can get chocked full of fine fuels when it rains a lot in October and November. In the last couple of years, we've had a lot of October and November rain. So it's grown a lot of those fine fuels. The upper elevations end up seeing a lot of their vegetation growth that will come off of winter, spring precipitation, and then monsoon precipitation. So you end up having really good, big, lush understory in the upper elevations of the Southwest when you have a good winter and then a good summer. So we had a good winter last year, but not a good summer. And so then that leaves us in kind of this weird spot of thinking about the health of the trees and the amount of moisture in the live trees, if they're drought stressed or not, and also the dead fuel on top of it, right? So that's, I think, how that kind of fire weather to fire climate all connects up. So we had a really dry summer. So does that create drought stress in trees? I would think so. I think that would be an ongoing drought stress. Could that drought stress be relieved by a good winter? Yeah, I think it probably could. And having good soil moisture in the spring and those trees taking up that soil moisture. And then we kind of bump along at these shorter windows is with the fuels that's on the ground, like these down logs and cured out vegetation. If it has access to moisture in these short windows prior to the fire season, they can kind of be more flammable or less flammable in that situation, right? So the failed summer monsoon, I was thinking, well, it extend the fire season. Well, maybe that's not necessarily the case because the fire weather is just going to be less supportive as we get colder. And even if we have these couple of events, like a little bit of precip here and there might help.
Well,
so it's almost like, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, extend. But what you mean, extend the fire?
The current. Yeah,
Meaning, though, in the sort of September, October, November period.
Yeah.
But it did extend the fire season in the summer period and basically the July and we had more July and August and probably September fires than we otherwise would have had.
Yeah, in Arizona, New Mexico, for sure, right? And the California thing is really different because they're going to end up having enhanced fire activity this month and next month, which is also prime fire season for Southern California because of Santa Ana wind events and those easterly wind events. So yeah, so going back to your kind of first, the question is what's the monsoon going to mean for next spring? I'm not sure. I don't think it's necessarily positive, but I think it's almost too early. I think we need to see how this winter shakes out. And so that'll kind of lead us into this discussion of a La Niña. There'll be really interesting research questions to kind of think about too, was if we end up having this record dry summer and a record dry winter, what's the contribution? Is that in total make a fire season worse, or was it really only the lack of winter precipitation that's going to be at play for enhancing that fire season?
So I looked into this a little bit too. As I was thinking about this today, I called up a recent paper, actually published this year by folks here at the University of Arizona. The first author is Alexis, I'm going to mispronounce the last name, Rizpe, Don Falk, Connie Woodhouse, and Thomas Swetnam. So people that have a long history in doing fire-related work, particularly with tree rings. And this paper is called Widespread Fire Years in the U.S.-Mexico Sky Islands Are Contingent on Both Winter and Monsoon Precipitation. So title is very spot on to the question that we just asked. So this is a paleoclimate study, which is really helpful because there's long records going back and it's a different perspective. They were looking at rainfall from tree ring or seasonal rainfall reconstructed from tree rings done by a CLIMAS alum, Dan Griffin. So shout out to his 2013 work, where he was like really one of the first to be able to look at the tree rings and separate the monsoon signal from the winter signal, which was really cool work. And so this paper then used that parsing of the seasonal rainfall and also looked at fire scars within nine mountain ranges in the Southwest, and basically came up with the years that produced widespread and frequent fires in these mountain ranges, and then plotted them in relation to what the winter precipitation value was and what the summer precipitation value was. And it turned out that basically all of the years, not all of them, a large fraction of the years that had fires in multiple mountain ranges happened during dry summers and dry winters. Now, here's the thing though, Mike, I had to dig around for this, which is more a function of my skimming reading ability than the articulation in the paper. But the monsoon that they were looking at was concurrent with the fire season and not the previous one, which is what we were just talking about. So they also addressed this question, and they did time series analyses. And basically the monsoon mattered in the season in which the fire was chronicled, but not the previous monsoon. So what did matter was basically the previous winter. The question though is like, these are paleo studies. How many records do they have that actually align with the really dry? I mean, how much of an analogs were there in their record versus what we just went through? I mean, we'll never be able to assess that. But again, we came off a pretty historically dry season. There's probably not many of those, even in the long paleo record, a handful of those. And whether or not those aligned with the years in which they've looked at or been able to tell that there was widespread and fires is something that we won't know. So, but I think the take home is that, yeah, the monsoon matters, but it seems to matter more for the current fire season for the ways that we've already talked about, which suppresses the fire season if there's a good monsoon, but more importantly, allows that fire season to be more vigorous because of dry conditions.
Again, I think that these fire seasons, especially in Arizona, they're not all kind of created equal, and we can get a little bit of apples and oranges. And so that total area burn, and if we think about last year too, it was, the November through March period was solid average, if not above average, for Southern Arizona. If we think of some of the Sky Island regions across Southern Arizona, we're thinking about some of this fire activity. So that precondition and the growth of fine fuels led to a situation at the end of the spring where the fuel loadings were high in the low desert and kind of up through mid elevations. And that's actually where we saw a lot of the fire activity. And so I don't believe we saw a lot of high elevation, like heavy timber fires this last summer, even with having a lot of area burned and a number of fires. So this going forward, it puts us in kind of an interesting spot where if you look at some of the fuel, like there's a tool called FuelCast that uses remote sensing to look at fuel loadings. If you look at across much of New Mexico and much of Arizona, around the foothills of mountains, and especially around the Sky Islands, the fact that we didn't have a monsoon season and it's been dry so far this fall is that the fine fuel loading is actually below average for this time of year. So kind of looking forward, that would mean that if you had low elevation fires, they might not connect up, turn into larger fires, and they might not move uphill. And so the dry winter might then just translate into higher fire risk because of drought stress at higher elevations. But then it also then relates to ignitions and the fire weather that carries a lot of these fires in the fire season. So I think we'll have a lot to talk about as we go through the winter and kind of monitor the conditions. And then as we get on the cusp of the fire season next spring, we'll have, I think, more to say and a little bit more in anticipation. I think I jumped the gun on trying to peg every problem of 2020 on the lack of monsoon precip.
It was our mental state at the moment. I mean, we needed to right. No, but let's just put a fine point on that, which is maybe not a fine point. Maybe the big point is, so this winter season is particularly important in terms of fire, particularly important for the higher elevations, more so probably than, well, I don't know, maybe I'm going beyond what you were saying, but it seems to be a more important part of the higher elevation stories, particularly if we get a dry winter on the heels of what we've just had.
Yeah, that's my understanding, kind of, and that paper really, that was kind of one of the take homes, right? We know that winter precip becomes a really important determinant of subsequent fire season activity.
Another point that I want to bring up, we don't have to belabor this, but since we are revisiting the monsoon and its myriad impacts, another one that cropped up recently that somebody brought to our attention was just the stream flow effect. That whatever rainfall and snowfall that was put down, less of it consequently would make it into the streams because the soils weren't replenished from the monsoon. So the expectation is that whatever streamfall we ultimately have, it's less than it otherwise would have been had monsoon not unfolded the way that it did.
Yeah, there's a couple of papers we should read for a future discussion on the stream flow aspect of this winter as we think about snow and stream flow. And just what you said is that there is this antecedent condition that's really important for conditioning stream flow in the spring, which is soil moisture conditions in the fall. And so, yeah, we're probably in very rare territory as far as having as dry as soil moisture as we do right now.
Okay, beautiful transition. How unprecedented are we right now at this moment in time? And being like on the heels of the dry monsoon, having just had very little, if any, rain in October, and looking forward to what is anticipated to be a moderate to strong La Niña event, which, as people I'm sure are well aware, overwhelmingly tends to bring drier conditions to the southern part of the Southwest. How unprecedented do you think that the situation is in terms of drought? Maybe we can just look at it through that lens.
Is this a multiple choice?
It can be.
Okay, give me A, B, and C. Like very unprecedented, not really, or I care not to answer. Is that?
Well, no, I'm going to do a 5-point Likert scale.
Okay.
Unprecedented, very unprecedented, neutral, somewhat unprecedented, and not unprecedented at all.
This is a little kind of, if you want to crack open my skull and look in my brain, I very rarely go extreme on those Likert scales. I'm one of those kind of Midland people, drives other people nuts sort of thing. But I'm going to say very unprecedented.
So is there much to say, Mike, about this unfolding La Nina besides that people expect it to be on the moderate to strong side of things?
I don't know if it's surprise, but I think in just sort of watching the event unfold is that there seems to be increasing confidence that it's going to be on the stronger side than on the weaker side. I think there was some uncertainty kind of early on in September and maybe August. And then that seems to have kind of given way to it. It's fully formed. It's impacting weather systems across the Pacific Ocean. It seems to be impacting even some of the forecast information we're seeing at the shorter term, like week 3-4 forecasts. So that to me is it's here, and it's moderate to maybe will continue to get stronger, and is expected to persist the next couple of months.
Yeah. So I tried to interrogate this question a little bit more, the unprecedented question. There just hasn't been many cases where we've come off of a dry summer and been in a La Nina.
Yeah.
Obviously the La Nina record only goes back to 1950. So we're only dealing with, and La Ninas are about 25% of the time. So we're not dealing with a lot of cases to begin with, but there was 10 years that saw below average rainfall, and that moved into a La Nina event. And it turns out that in only one of those years was the wintertime rain above average. And that is exactly what you would expect. I believe in like Southern Arizona, there's only 3 of the 22 cases or so of the La Ninas that actually produced above average rainfall anyway. So you just wouldn't expect chances to be very high for a wet winter. So I guess the point here is we should be bracing for expanding and deepening drought conditions.
Yes. Yep. I think that's right.
Yeah. I guess I don't have much more to say about that. Okay. Well, Mike, any parting shots?
Did we talk about everything we were going to talk about?
Yep. I think we did cover everything that we wanted to cover, Mike. I mean, we've got a lot to unpack as this winter unfolds, and, perhaps it'll throw us a curveball, and perhaps 2021 will buck the 2020 trend of pretty crappy year. And so maybe there's some optimism just in the future for us. That's what I'm going to end with.
That's great. And I think, taking this idea that you and I are so invested now in the failed monsoon and drought conditions coming up, maybe that's the right attitude to throw at 2020, because what it'll throw back is record wet conditions.
Boy,
right? Am I playing this right?
I hope so, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure it's hearing you, but we'll try. All
right, we'll give it another shot next month. We got one more month of 2020 to try to make that work.
All right, Mike. Well, thanks as always. It's good to have some therapy, climate therapy with you.
It's been fun. Appreciate it.
Ben, I am just going through all of your Slack messages. A lot of gifts.
That's my fault.
Here we go.
I got to say real quick too, I think I abused the English language by saying, can there be something that's very unprecedented? Because isn't unprecedented mean it's never happened before?
Yeah, I think I set you up for that.
Could it be sort of unprecedented?